Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are continuing our discussion of the musicals in the online version. We don't know how long it will take, but this week definitely. Today we'll talk about Shakespeare and the musical theatre. I hope you have seen West Side Story and Kiss Me Kate. Perhaps some other musicals inspired by Shakespeare. We'll talk about them in a little moment. As many of you know, the Western culture has two, perhaps three holy books. One is the Bible, the other one perhaps the works of Plato, but the third is definitely the complete plays of William Shakespeare. There is a saying, especially in the English-speaking world, that if something has not been mentioned either in the Bible or in Shakespeare, it probably does not exist. So the complete spectrum of human behavior, human psychology can be found in these works. And of course, the plays of William Shakespeare are very high on the list. Some theatre historians, theatre critics say that possibly half of world theatre in any form nowadays is in debt to William Shakespeare. Hard to say. Definitely Shakespeare initiated or popularized many tropes of the theatre and you might call them archetypal stories, that is the stories that are constantly repeating themselves in various forms, various variants from the beginning of human civilization. And one of such stories, of course, is Romeo and Juliet. That is the story about the star-crossed lovers. So we have boy meet girl, boy loses girl, and boy regains the girl or not. There are a few more archetypal stories if you think about that. I will give you the link to my article I wrote about Shakespeare, about West Side Story basically. Unfortunately it's in Polish, but I hope most of you will be able to read it, so you will have the archetypal stories there and all that. So of course West Side Story, which is inspired by Romeo and Juliet, was not the first musical to be inspired by Shakespeare. If you think about it, you might even say that Shakespeare wrote something similar to musical theatre. Many of his plays include songs, many of his plays are staged now with the songs actually with music in a sung form. They were not exactly musicals, especially not in the modern sense, but they were popular theatre. So the current treatment, going back to mostly to the 19th century, of treating Shakespeare as the bard, as the highbrow culture for the elite culture that requires special, sophisticated taste and education, was not true in the times of Shakespeare. This was popular theatre, this was theatre for the masses. Generally, Elizabethan theatre was popular theatre. And the songs were there, so you might say it's one of the predecessors of the modern musical theatre. Of course, now Shakespeare has been inspirational for many different genres of theatre and film, some which belong to what is popularly called the high art, like opera and ballet. There are lots of works inspired by Shakespeare, also Romeo and Juliet, which are operas and ballets, but also more popular genres such as the musical. And as you might expect, the first inspiration to come from Shakespeare were the comedies. So not the tragedies like Romeo and Juliet, but comedies. Shakespeare wrote lots of comedies and they were regarded as quite funny, especially in his time. And definitely the musical theater, which, if we look at the beginning, if we look at the Broadway theater of the 30s, of the 40s, this mostly presented comedies. So Shakespearean comedies were very inspirational. Probably the first musical inspired by Shakespeare would be The Boys from Syracuse from 1938, with the music by Richard Rodgers and lyrics by Lawrence Hart. This was an adaptation of the Comedy of Errors, so it was quite popular. There were other less successful shows. Some of them were outright flops, like a musical called Swinging the Dream, which was an adaptation of the Midsummer Night's Dream, with very good cast, with very good creative team, but yes, they flopped. They went out of the theater after only 2 weeks. But another successful musical that I would like to focus a bit more on is Kiss Me Kate by Cole Porter from 1948. Which is based on another Shakespearean comedy, The Taming of the Shrew. So those of you who are familiar with Shakespeare, and those of you who watched the film or stage version of Kiss Me Kate, observe that it's meant to be a comedy. Of course, for the modern audience, for the modern viewer, the comedy of suppressing the spirit of a woman through violence, even though it's masked by comedy. It's not very funny, but in 1948 nobody really questioned that. And Cole Porter, if you remember from our discussion of the history of the musical as a genre, was a big name in the musical theater, big name on Broadway. He was a specialist of the old style of the musical, in which the songs could be freely juggled, and they were mostly light-hearted romantic comedies. Something like Anything Goes, if you remember. So, but of course, what happens is Oklahoma and Rodgers and Hammerstein's formula for the integrated musicals, and Cole Porter decided that perhaps he should try to write an integrated musical as well. So he made, and he was responsible both for the music and the lyrics, he made Kiss Me Kate. This is not exactly a straight adaptation of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. It is partially a backstage musical, so a musical about making a musical, because it's set in the theater or behind the stage of the theater, where they are staging what seems to be a musical adaptation of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. Not the original material. We do not have the original text. We do not have really the original story. It is a musical based on The Taming of the Shrew, but we have another storyline which is happening off stage between the actors and the producer, the director, and basically the people involved in the production of this musical version of The Taming of the Shrew. So the stars who are supposed to play the leading roles of Catherine and Mercutio are ex-husband and wife who are not friends anymore, and the divorce was a rather stormy one, and they have a lot of bitterness towards each other, but it's fairly visible from the beginning that there are some feelings still left. So we have Lily and Fred, the main characters, the actors who are supposed to play the leading roles in The Taming of the Shrew. If you remember Oklahoma, there was this formula of the romantic couples repeated and becoming more and more comical depending on the social class of the characters. And of course we have such characters in Kiss Me Kate as well, because there is the actress who's supposed to play Catherine's good and nice and polite and malleable sister Bianca. However, she is not such in a real life. Lois, the actress supposed to play Bianca, is a flirty, sexy girl, very much like Adu Annie, if you remember her, and some other characters from this type of a comical, sexy young woman. And her boyfriend, who is also of a lower social class, so he's more comical than romantic, Bill, he has a gambling problem, and he has some trouble with the gangsters. He owes the money to the gangsters, so we have the theme of the gangsters is quite typical for Cole Porter. If you remember Anything Goes, there were some small-time crooks being stowed away on a ship. So we have the gangsters here as well, and they are quite important, as you will see in a little moment. So Kiss Me Kate was a very successful show. The formula worked for Cole Porter. This was the first musical to win the Tony Award for Best Musical in 1949. It was one of the first shows to have more than 1,000 performances on Broadway, so a record in its time for a long run. And very early, because in 1953 there was an MGM film adaptation which was also quite successful, and would get some awards, including Oscar nominations. So it's a comedy, and the inspiration with Shakespeare is relatively superficial, because if you look at the fragments which are supposed to be the staging of The Taming of the Shrew, it's much more farcical, and it uses something that Cole Porter was a specialist of, namely the novelty song. The novelty song is a surprising song, usually with witty, linguistically witty lyrics. For example, the opening scene in this supposedly Shakespearean play, when Fred as Mercutio comes to Padua, uses something that you may remember from this musical, a song that is based on one concept, the concept of finding some rhyme to the word Padua. So in English language you may think of some rhymes, but Padua is not the most rhyming word. But of course Cole Porter comes up with some comedic rhymes for the word Padua. That's really what it becomes. So the comedy by Shakespeare is transformed into a kind of farce with slapstick, with puns on language, and of course the other plot line of the warring former lovers who rediscover that they still have feelings for each other, uses slightly different inspirations, especially the song that introduces the romantic theme between Lily and Fred, called Wunderbar in German. Why? Because the Sound of Music, and because the long tradition of the Viennese operetta. So the song is in the style of the operetta, and also uses this German word. But something that I would like you to watch now is a little excerpt of the probably most famous novelty song from this musical, namely Brush Up Your Shakespeare, sung and danced by the two gangsters, by the two crooks. There is, of course, very frequently in comedy you have subjects of mistaken identities. So Fred is mistaken for Bill, and the two gangsters have to guard him so he does not run away with the money. But it turns out that Fred is in distress because Lily threatened to walk out of the performance, and the play, the opening night, is in peril. So what do Slug and Lippy do? They try to cheer up the leading man by singing praise of Shakespeare. And this is now a good moment to listen to the song again, perhaps to look up the lyrics. And my question is, do they really know their Shakespeare? They say brush up your Shakespeare, so they assume that everybody knows Shakespeare, probably from school. Do they really know their Shakespeare? If you listen to the lyrics, or if you read the lyrics, you can observe that what they mostly know are titles of Shakespeare's plays, and we have a typical Cole Porter novelty song with a lot of linguistic puns, of course finding rhymes to the titles of Shakespeare's plays. That's really that's the humor here, that of course even the lowlife, and of course one of them is slightly more sophisticated than the other, which is visible in the style of dancing and in the style of singing. One of them acts as a kind of leader here in this song, and he's supposed to know Shakespeare better and to appreciate him better, and especially to appreciate the assumed power of Shakespeare to attract women. Does it work? Well, to some extent it does, and at least for me, the finale of Kiss Me Kate is quite rushed, and Lily returns and she even kisses Bill on stage. We do not really know, especially in the film version, whether it's supposed to be part of the Taming of the Shrew or a reconciliation between the ex-couple. This happens at the last moment. This happens very unexpectedly. It's not well developed through the play, but perhaps this is supposed to be the miracle of Shakespeare. And the success of Kiss Me Kate brought about several more attempts of transforming and adapting Shakespeare's comedies for the musical theatre, but there was someone who decided to do a tragedy, and we'll talk about it in the next